Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Several months back, I declared my series on the 2020 Democratic candidates to be on hiatus, barring the entry of any new contenders. Well, it appears that a few new people have decided to throw their hats into the ring, or at this juncture, or at least thinking about it. So I'd like to talk about one of them today. His name is Howard Schultz, and he is someone who is about as minor could be in the context of democratic politics. However, I think I'll make a video about him anyway, since I've already made videos about people like Mitch Landrieu and Tim Kaine and other people who stand very little chance. So let's talk about Howard Schultz. So, who is Howard Schultz and why does he matter, or not matter? Well, Howard Schultz, his main claim to fame is being the CEO of Starbucks from 1986 to 2000, and again from 2008 until his retirement in June of 2017. And at Starbucks, he is more or less responsible for founding the Starbucks that we know today, the place which serves that wide variety of coffee and espresso-based drinks. And he had a major falling out with the original founders of Starbucks over the direction of the company. He left, and then when they decided to stay with a traditional coffee shop model and go in the direction of Peet's Coffee and Tea, they sold the rights to use the Starbucks name to Howard Schultz. So he basically did found a renegade company which was based heavily on an existing company. And at any rate, though, his success was because he went to Italy and he noticed the kinds of drinks that they were serving, and then he modeled Starbucks to imitate that, but also integrate things that Americans already liked, like drip coffee. So he was a very successful businessman, and he found a model and stuck to it, and made quite a bit of money with it. He also has some claim to fame as being the former owner of the NBA's Seattle Supersonics and the WNBA's Seattle Storm, both of which teams he no longer owns. He is also the author or co-author of 3 different books. 2 of them are on Starbucks, so I don't really care. And then the most recent one is called For Love of Country, and due to the title alone, I have to suspect that this is a strong indication that Howard Schultz has some political ambitions and that he wants to be a politically relevant figure. Well, that combined with all the interviews he does about politics and things like that. But anyway, it's pretty clear that he is thinking of running in 2020. In previous videos, I've talked a little bit about how different companies expect cities to bid on their services and to give them lots of free stuff and incentives to stay or move to that place. Well, sports teams unfortunately operate along a similar modus operandi. And in the case of Howard Schultz, he was expecting Seattle to build him a new arena on the public dime for his Supersonics to play in. And of course, he would have been the primary beneficiary of this move. The city of Seattle would have not made nearly as much money as the owner of the Sonics would have. And the city did not approve. They voted it down. So Howard Schultz got pissed off, and then he decided to sell both of his basketball teams, the Sonics and the Storm, to investment groups who were happy to buy it. And the group that ended up selling the Supersonics to happened to be located in Oklahoma City, and then they relocated the Sonics franchise there and renamed it the Oklahoma City Thunder. Schultz, during his time as the Sonics owner, also had a very public feud with Gary Payton because Payton didn't show up to the first day of 2002's training camp. I'm not really sure who was at fault there, but because Gary Payton was the greatest player in Sonics history, he was a former Defensive Player of the Year, I believe, up until the present. He is still the only point guard in NBA history to ever win Defensive Player of the Year. He gave Michael Jordan fits in the 1996 NBA Finals. That was probably Jordan's worst performance in the Finals because Payton guarded him for a few games. Anyway, because Payton was so important to Seattle, Schultz was definitely portrayed as the bad guy in that situation. And at the time when he sold the team, it's important to know why people in Seattle are probably still a little pissed about it. So Kevin Durant actually played his rookie season in Seattle, and he had a phenomenal rookie season. It was very clear he was going to become a superstar. And the year between them being in Seattle and then relocating to Oklahoma City, that was the off season where they drafted Russell Westbrook, who was the MVP the year before last. So had the team remained in the Northwest, they would have been in the finals in 2012. So again, you can imagine how Schultz would struggle to impress people from his home area, and how his ownership of a sports team would be less cool and a little more frustrating, since he not only tried to extort his home city, but then sold one of their popular franchises, and they have not been able to replace that franchise since. Seattle is still without a professional basketball team in the NBA. Running a sports franchise out of town or into the ground is not necessarily fatal. Just ask George W. Bush. He didn't do a great job with the Rangers. But the thing that really is a problem for Howard Schultz is the way that Starbucks treats its employees. So ironically, his main claim to fame, the only thing that makes him a national figure and even someone who could be considered as a presidential contender, is also his biggest liability. So, to be fair, Starbucks is not even close to being the worst offender when it comes to treating its employees poorly. They pay better than minimum wage, and they have a decent benefits package for full-time employees. I understand they also can provide health care for part-time employees, which is not common for service industry jobs. So, they deserve some degree of credit. However, you don't do well at Starbucks, really. You don't make a living wage normally. And Starbucks is also a member of the National Restaurants Association, a group dedicated to making sure that fast food and service industry workers don't make a living wage and don't live decent lives. The main goal of the National Restaurant Association, which some people call the other NRA, is union busting and wage suppression. So they like to promote things like the idea that wage increases or minimum wage increases will drive up prices and hurt consumers. And they do everything in their power to fight against the Fight for 15. Not to mention that the union busters in chief at Walmart and McDonald's offer their expertise to other companies through the NRA, or the second NRA, and this is why you see so few unionized workplaces in the service industry. So Starbucks, even if they do treat their employees a little better than most, they are still helping to do their part to perpetuate the system where service industry workers are abused and exploited. Another thing that won't play well in a time of extreme inequality is that Schultz's net worth is around $2.8 billion, and he has earned around $75 for each dollar earned by a typical barista working for Starbucks. So, while he can claim to have done very well for himself and to have founded a very successful brand, he can't really claim to have lifted a bunch of people out of poverty or made their lives better. So this will be something that will be used against him, and it puts him firmly in the elite establishment wing of the party, where the energy in the Democratic Party right now simply is not. Let's take a look at Howard Schultz's political views and why those would be something of an impediment during a Democratic primary. So, on the environment, immigration, and social issues, Howard Schultz is pretty solidly liberal. I don't think that he would come across as too far left or too moderate or conservative on those views. I think he would be sort of in the Goldilocks zone of the Democratic Party. That being said, I don't think that he would necessarily inspire anybody by his stances there, since he would be in line with pretty much every other candidate by and large. He also is in favor of free trade. Now, many people, due to Trump derangement syndrome, have taken up the view that free trade is a left position simply because Donald Trump holds the opposite view. However, it really is not a liberal position. It is more of an elite position rather than something that falls along the left-right spectrum. It's more along the elite populist spectrum. There are plenty of people on the left who oppose free trade. Sherrod Brown, Bernie Sanders, Many of the other progressives who will probably run in 2020 are against free trade, and not because they're to the right of people who are for it. At any rate, his other stated views, which are admittedly a bit few in number, he worries that Democrats have gone too far left in the general sense. And I imagine what he's talking about are economics. He's probably one of those people who looks at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in horror and thinks, oh my God, we've gone socialist. We're going to lose the great middle in America. He is one of those kinds, so far as I can tell. He also thinks that Medicare for all is unrealistic, and he is opposed to it. And right now, Medicare for all polls extremely well, and most people in the country are of the opinion that this is the direction that we need to take. They did a poll on Fox and Friends, actually, on whether it would be worthwhile to spend the $32+ trillion on Medicare for all, as Bernie has proposed. So they framed it in a very conservative frame to a conservative audience, and still 73% of the people responding out of like 31 or 32,000 respondents said, yeah, it would be worth that much money. So this is an extremely popular position both among Democrats and Republicans, independents, everybody else. And if the Democrats were to run a candidate who did not support this, that candidate would have a hell of a hard time inspiring voters. Not to mention that I don't think you're going to get through the Democratic primary without being in favor of Medicare for all. But the thing that really animates Howard Schultz the most is the national debt. He says the national debt is the greatest threat to America. And in political discussions, he might mention other issues, but this is the one that he really sticks on. So, in other words, I think that if Nancy Pelosi were able to choose a candidate to run, she might endorse someone like a Howard Schultz, since she has tried to promote that idea of pay-go, which is basically just a way to shut down any kind of progressive initiative. So she would be in favor of someone like Howard Schultz, and maybe some of the other congressional Democrats would also feel the same way. But in terms of your average everyday voter, I just don't think that Howard Schultz and his views will have a lot of appeal. For the last 4 or so decades, we have been burdened by what I call the myth of the business hero. And this is the idea that CEOs and other high-level business people have this kind of all-encompassing general competence that applies to all fields of endeavor, and that their success in business would translate to any other field. If they were to apply themselves to medicine, science, or anything else, they would be able to succeed just as well as anyone in those fields. Or the idea that if you can run one company that makes computer chips, you would be equally able to run a railroad or a pizza chain or anything else. Now, I think that this view is fundamentally incorrect and ridiculous, and I'm going to explain why. And this is more about why I think Howard Schultz or any other CEO-style president would be a disaster, rather than why I think he would struggle in a primary. So this is a bit of a tangent, but I think that it's important. One of the main reasons why CEOs have no ability to govern is because they rule their companies by fiat. The autocratic stylings of Bush and Trump were learned behaviors as much as, if not more so than, character defects. A lot of people pretend like the problem with Trump is that he has some sort of personality disorder, and I mean, maybe he does. And maybe a lot of that also is from growing up as a trust fund baby and never having anyone tell him no. But at the same time, he's always been his own boss. He's never worked for another person. No one has ever told Donald Trump no. He has been used to getting his way and running his own business empire. He was more like a monarch than like what we'd consider to be an acceptable elected leader. CEOs also, to the extent that they're accountable to anyone, they're accountable to shareholders. This is a small, elite, special interest group, and you only have to please them to stay in power and continue to collect massive bonuses. You don't have to consult the public interest if you are a corporate CEO. So Howard Schultz, while he provided a very popular product that many people love and enjoy on a daily basis, the thing that kept him at the top of Starbucks was the fact that he basically founded the company, and then he was able to keep his shareholders happy because he was bringing in the profits. CEO culture, like I said, has that sort of myth that business skills transcend all aspects of life. I just don't see it. It's just like I reject the theory of general intelligence, the idea that people have about the same level of aptitude for all parts of human endeavor. I have yet to meet the person who is quite that evenly balanced, although I will admit some people are far more balanced than others. I mean, for my part, I'm not very balanced in terms of my varying levels of competency. But anyway, it's sort of a ridiculous idea to expect someone to be really good at one thing and also, by extension, to be really good at something that is completely unrelated. Not to mention that CEOs are responsible for making profit, whereas the government is responsible for providing services and also for security and all kinds of other functions that companies don't have to worry about. I would also point out that running a company in one industry and mastering the relevant rules of the game there is not germane to being able to set overarching policies which help the economy as a whole. So you might be able to figure out policies which would help your own company. We've talked about people in various industries doing that. I made a video where we talked about Enron. And Enron was very good at figuring out policies that benefited themselves. However, their policies were not for the public good. They didn't even benefit the energy industry as a whole necessarily. So I just don't think that business experience is something that is conducive to good political management. They're fundamentally different fields of endeavor. Just like, since we're sort of on the topic of basketball because of Schultz being the owner of the Sonics. Another example, Michael Jordan, greatest basketball player to ever play, and a totally shit owner with the Charlotte Hornets. So, there you go. I mean, that's even in a related field, but it's a different aspect of that field. Being able to score at will is not the same as being able to build a team. So, in conclusion, it's pretty hard for me to imagine a scenario where Schultz has a strong path to the nomination. Now, granted, the public mood could shift, and I think the public mood is a highly underrated factor, but since we're so far out from the election, it's hard to predict. But based on the factors that we can predict, I just don't see it happening. Now, one thing I could see a little bit is that if the establishment politicians don't run or fail in some way, so the Joe Biden, Cory Booker types, if they just don't pan out for whatever reason, and it's only people who are either progressive or pseudo-progressive in the field, then I could see Howard Schultz maybe being able to rally the corporate interest around him, the party establishment, and maybe some of the more right-leaning voters. But even then, I think that the energy on in the Democratic Party is definitely on the progressive side of the things, and I just can't see where Schultz would get the votes that he needs to pull off a nomination. This is because he has no relevant experience. Right now, people would be looking for a leader who can fix the problems of the country and the party, and Schultz doesn't really have a proven track record in either of those things. And his views, like I said, are out of touch with both the party base and with the country, especially on Medicare for All. He would be totally out of sync there. And without him running with a strong economic message, which he definitely wouldn't, I don't see him striking a strong contrast with Trump. I could see him winning the popular vote but losing the Electoral College, basically just pulling a Hillary 2.0. Unless you have a strong economic message, you can't beat another economic populist, even a fake one like Trump. And so anyway, Schultz nominating him would be disastrous. If he somehow did manage to get into the White House, I don't think that he would be a very successful president for the reasons that I outlined on why CEOs can't govern. So I am firmly against him running or being nominated. So anyway, that's my video on Howard Schultz. Fortunately, I do think that his chances are very, very slim. So anyway, peace out.